Imagine a winter so violent that the ocean's spray freezes in midair, turning the wind into a volley of horizontal glass knives that can pierce a heavy wool coat in seconds. This is the Isle of Lewis, the northernmost tip of Scotland's outer Hebrides. As the year 1894 draws to a close, here, on the edge of the known world, the climate is not merely cold, it is a living, breathing predator. The North Atlantic gales scream across the landscape at 95 miles per hour, unchecked by trees, because the soil is too shallow and the wind too salty for anything larger than heather to take root. If you stand on the cliffs of Ness, you will feel an endless, rain-lashed moorland where the damp cold hunts you. It is easy to assume that survival in this treeless wasteland is an impossibility. In truth, the absolute temperature rarely drops to the extremes seen in the Arctic Circle, but the bone-chilling humidity, which constantly hovers above 90%, changes the physics of heat loss entirely. When, combined with nearly 100-mile-per-hour gales, the convective cooling effect on the human skin is devastating. It creates a wind-chill heat loss equivalent to a brutal, dry, minus 50 degrees Celsius environment. If you step outside, unprepared, the damp wind will sap your core temperature in a matter of minutes, leaving you disoriented and freezing. Yet, despite this lack of terrestrial resources, the residents of these islands did not flee. Instead, they built the Taigh Dubh, or the Blackhouse. From a distance, these structures do not look like houses at all. They look like low, rounded mounds of stone and turf rising, organic and quiet from the peat bogs. They have no towering brick chimneys, no large glass windows, and no overhanging eaves. To the untrained eye, they seem like primitive hovels. But in reality, they are highly sophisticated, thermodynamic shelters, designed to neutralize the most violent storms in Europe. If you want to understand how our ancestors lived without modern heating systems, you must look closely at these structures. If you are enjoying this deep dive into forgotten history, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more weekly survival documentaries. On a rocky rise overlooking the gray waters of the Minch, the Black House of Ranald MacDonald stands as a monument to ancestral survival. Ranald is a crofter, a man whose hands are mapped with deep scars from decades of harvesting, peat, and hauling kelp. His face, weathered by salt and wind, carries the quiet stoicism of a generation that has learned to live in harmony with a hostile environment. His Black House is exactly like those of his ancestors, low profile, long and thick-walled, with a thatch roof that has turned dark gray from years of peat smoke. To the estate managers who visit from the mainland, Ranald's home is a relic of a dark and backward age. They see a building with no windows, a floor of hard-packed earth, and a roof that leaks smoke, rather than channeling it through a chimney. But Ranald knows the secret of the stone. He knows that his home is warmer, drier, and more stable than any modern structure built with imported materials. When the winter storms rattle the wooden window frames of the new houses down in the valley, Ranald sits comfortably in his living quarters, listening to the gale slide over his low, curved roof without shaking the structure. His lifestyle is a methodical dance with nature, built on a step-by-step understanding of the materials available to him. He does not view the wind as an enemy to be fought with rigid walls. He views it as a force to be deflected and absorbed. His Black House does not stand against the storm. It lets the storm pass over it. For Ranald, the ancestral wisdom of the Taigh Dubh is not a choice, but a lifeline that has kept his family alive through generations of brutal Atlantic dark. He knows that the earth beneath his feet holds a steady warmth, and that the thick stone walls around him are a heat battery that never fails. The fragile peace of the crofting community is shattered in November 1894 with the arrival of Gavin Douglas. Gavin is the newly appointed factor, the estate manager representing a wealthy, absent landlord from the Scottish mainland. He is a young man, dressed in a tailored wool suit and polished leather boots that are entirely unsuited for the muddy Hebridean bogs. Gavin is a champion of Victorian modernization, a man who believes that progress can be measured in straight lines, mortared brick, and slate roofs. He looks upon the traditional blackhouses of Lewis with open disgust, viewing them as unhygienic, primitive hovels that reflect poorly on the estate's reputation. Gavin has recently overseen the construction of his own modern cottage on a Taigh, prominent hill near the harbor. It is a handsome, two-story wood frame building supported by a thin concrete foundation with a tall, straight brick chimney, a roof of clean, dark slate. Gavin calls it a triumph of civilized architecture. He intends to use it as a model for the entire island, hoping to force the Taigh crofters to abandon their traditional homes and rent his newly designed cottages. On a cold, damp morning, Gavin rides his horse to Ranald's Croft, his boots sinking into the black mud. He stands before the low entrance of the Blackhouse, his face twisted in a sneer as the smell of burning peat and cattle draft reaches his nose. He tells Ranald that his home is a disgrace, a smoky tomb that no civilized man should inhabit. He presents Ranald with a formal paper and action, ultimatum. Ranald must begin dismantling his Blackhouse and move his family into one of the new slate-roofed cottages by the end of the winter, or face immediate eviction from his croft. Gavin tells him that the landlord will no longer tolerate backwardness on his estate, and that the law is on his side. Ranald listens in silence, his weathered face showing no emotion as he takes the paper. He looks at Gavin's polished boots, then at the modern cottage standing vulnerable on the hill, and he says nothing. He knows that winter is coming, and that the island is an unforgiving teacher. To survive a winter on the Outer Hebrides, you must first harvest the energy of the spations, the land, and the sea. This is not a task for the weak or the hesitant. It requires a meticulous step-by-step preparation that begins long before the blank's first frost of November. For Ranald MacDonald and the men of Ness, the process of securing their winter lipids and proteins is a terrifying annual journey to the desolate, wave-battered rock of Sula Skier, 40 miles north of Lewis. Here, in the late weeks of August, they hunt the guga, the young, fledgling gonnet. The hunt is a dangerous exercise in maritime survival. The men must land their open wooden boats on slippery, sheer cliffs, scaling the rock with ropes while the Atlantic swells crash below. They harvest several thousand young birds before they have reached the capacity for flight, when their bodies are thickest with rich, yellow fat. The preservation process must begin immediately on the 5 rock. The birds are plucked, singed with burning heather to remove the fine, down, gutted, and scrubbed clean. The core of their preservation is a methodical, dry salting and stacking technique. The carcasses are heavily salted, skin side down, and arranged in massive, concentric, circular piles. This specific packing geometry forces out moisture, while letting the salt penetrate the dense muscle fibers. When the men return to Ness, the guga is stored in the dark corners of the Blackhouse, hanging from the beams. It is an acquired taste, salty, fishy, and incredibly rich, but its biological value is immense. In the harsh arithmetic of Hebridean survival, these preserved fats and proteins are the fuel that maintains human metabolic heat through the dark months. One young bird can sustain a working man for days, providing the concentrated calories necessary to work the moors in freezing rain. While the sea provides the fat, the moors provide the fire. Throughout May and June, Ranald spends his days cutting peat, the only fuel available on these treeless islands. He uses a trisker, an ancient, right-angled peat-cutting iron. The tool is a masterpiece of functional design, featuring a long wooden shaft and a sharp steel blade with a vertical wing. By placing his foot on the wooden peg and pressing downward, Ranald can slice uniform, rectangular blocks of peat with remarkable speed. He then pries the wet, heavy sod from the earth, stacking it in small tripod-like structures called reed heen to dry in the wind. This is not a casual chore. A typical blackhouse requires between 45–60 full cartloads of dried peat to maintain the central hearth through the winter. The extraction rate must be precise. If the peat is cut too thin, it will burn too fast. If it is cut too thick, it will never dry. Once cured by the Taigh summer wind, the peat is hauled back to the croft and stacked in a neat, rounded pile near the entrance. This stack is built with the bark side of the sods, facing outward to shed rain, creating a self-protecting dome of fuel. This continuous 24-hour combustion cycle is the thermal heart of the Blackhouse, and securing it requires months of silent, back-breaking labor on the Kloss, open bog. When a gale-force wind hits a standard vertical wall, it does not simply push against it. It is forced upward, accelerating as it climbs. When this high-velocity airstream reaches the overhanging eaves of a conventional roof, it creates a massive upward lift, acting like the wing of an airplane. Under 45 to 50 pounds of wind pressure per square foot, the roof is literally sucked off the building. This is the fatal flaw in modern architecture, one that Gavin Douglas's new slate-roofed cottage suffers from. The Hebridean builders solved this problem through a geometric innovation known as the Taigh technique. The wooden roof frame of the Blackhouse is not placed on the outer edge of the wall, but is recessed onto the inner edge of the planar, massive dry stone walls. This placement creates a wide, flat stone ledge, Dubh, that completely surrounds the structure at the roofline. This ledge functions as a pressure reduction device. When the wind hits the windhen's vertical stone wall and climbs, it does not transition smoothly into an upward draft. Instead, it hits the flat ledge, which acts as a spoiler. This creates a localized, high-velocity vortex that rolls back on itself, disrupting the upward airflow and forcing it to slide harmlessly over the curved thatch roof. Instead of lifting the roof, the wind pressure is converted into a downward force that actually presses the thatch tighter against the wooden rafters. The Taigh is lined with thick, green turf placed grass side up, which serves to channel any rainwater away from the wooden frame and direct it toward the outer stone skin. The roof itself is a multi-layered thermal barrier. It begins with a layer of turf placed face down over the wooden rafters, followed by a thick thatch of barley straw or heather. Unlike modern thatched roofs, these were not designed to shed water with a steep, rigid pitch. They are relatively shallow, averaging an angle of 30 to 35 degrees, which reduces wind resistance. Because iron nails were a luxury that would corrode in the salt-heavy Atlantic air, the thatch is secured using an elegant system based on gravity and friction. The entire roof is covered in a dense network of ropes called suganane, woven from heather or straw. Meticulous, horizontal primary ropes, known as mather shomhain, are spaced at intervals of approximately 1.5 feet across the roof. These serve as anchor points for diagonal ropes, called fear again, which weave back and forth across the thatch, like a net. To hold this network in place, massive stone weights, each weighing between 20 and 30 pounds, are tied to the ends of the ropes and suspended just over the edge of the stone wall. This creates a flexible, dynamic link. When a siege storm batters the house, a rigid roof would fight the pressure and eventually snap. The Blackhouse roof, however, can vibrate, shift, and absorb the kinetic energy of the wind. During the summer months, as the thatch dries and shrinks, the weights can be adjusted easily to tighten the ropes. In winter, as the straw absorbs moisture and swells, the ropes can be loosened to prevent structural stress. The Blackhouse does not fight the wind. It lets the wind slide over its rounded shoulders, absorbing the impact through gravity and flexibility. It is an orderly system that has been refined over 500 years of trial and error, and it requires no manufactured hardware to keep the family safe. The walls of the Blackhouse are engineered to function as a high-mass fortress against the environment. They are massive, measuring between 6 and 9 feet, thick at the base and tapering slightly inward as they rise, a structural technique known as batter. This batter lowers the center of gravity, making the walls incredibly stable against lateral wind loads. The walls consist of 2 completely parallel skins of local gneiss stone, constructed using the dry stone method without a single ounce of mortar. To a modern builder like Gavin Douglas, a mortared wall is the only proper way to build. But in a region characterized by constant wind vibration and high-velocity gales, a rigid mortared structure is a liability. The constant vibration of the storm causes the mortar to develop microscopic cracks. Over ob2 time, water enters these cracks, freezes during cold snaps, expands, and eventually shatters the wall. The dry stone method avoids this failure path. Because the stones are placed without mortar, the wall possesses a natural flexibility. It can absorb kinetic shocks, shift slightly during a storm, and settle into the ground without losing its structural integrity. The stone slabs are laid with a slight outward angle, ensuring that any rainwater that penetrates the outer skin is directed by gravity away from the interior of the house. Between these 2 stone shells lies the Dubh, a high-density core of peat, mud, moss, and sandy turf. This organic layer is the true secret of the wall's insulation. It functions as both a thermal barrier and a moisture control system. When wind-driven rain penetrates the gaps in the outer dry stone skin, it does not reach the interior. Instead, the dry, fibrous peat mud of the Dubh absorbs the water, swelling slightly to create an airtight seal that stops the wind from blowing through. Once the rain stops, the wind drying the exterior wall draws that moisture back, out through the outer stone skin, keeping the interior of the house dry. This organic core also fills every void between the rough, unhewn stones, preventing cold drafts from infiltrating the living space. The thick stone walls also utilize the principle of thermal mass to stabilize the interior temperature. During the day, the massive stones on the interior skin absorb heat from the central peat fire and the metabolic heat of the inhabitants. When the fire burns low at night, the stones release this stored energy slowly back into the room, preventing the rapid temperature drops that plague wood frame structures. The foundation of the wall is equally simple and effective. It consists of large, flat footing stones placed directly on a bed of gravel. This gravel layer acts as a capillary break, preventing groundwater from rising into the stone walls through suction. Every element of the wall, from the choice of stone to the placement of the organic core, is a calculated response to the physics of Dubh, wind and water, requiring only materials that can be gathered within a mile of the croft. Inside the Blackhouse, the layout is a lesson in thermodynamic efficiency. The interior is not divided into separate rooms by thick, insulated walls. Instead, it is a single, continuous space where humans and animals live in a shared, cooperative energy cycle. This is not a product of poverty or primitive living. It is a calculated engineering choice designed to maximize heat retention and air circulation. The central peat hearth, known as the caliche, is the primary engine of the home. It is positioned on a flat stone slab in the middle of the living quarters, and it is maintained continuously, often burning for decades without being extinguished. The heat from this central fire does not simply warm the air. It radiates directly outward in all directions, warming the interior stone, walls, and the hard-packed earth floor. The decision to eliminate the chimney was a deliberate, thermodynamic calculation. In a standard house, a chimney is a thermal chimney, creating an upward draft that sucks warm air out of the building. For every cubic foot of hot air that goes up the chimney, a cubic foot of cold, damp air must be drawn in from the outside, through drafts in the doors and windows. This is the stack effect. By allowing the peat smoke to rise and filter slowly through the thick thatch roof, the Blackhouse achieves nearly 100% thermal efficiency. Every single joule of energy released by the burning peat remains within the living envelope. The warm air rises, warming the interior thatch and turf layers, which in turn radiate heat back down into the room. But living in a chimneyless environment requires a specific understanding of fluid dynamics. As the peat burns, the hot phenolic smoke rises to the peak of the arch, where it stabilizes in the upper strata of the room, typically about 5 feet above the floor. Beneath this smoke line, the air remains relatively clean and clear, drawn toward the hearth by the low-level draft of the fire. To survive in this environment, the Hebridean people engineered a low-profile lifestyle. All their furniture is designed with an extremely low center of gravity. The wooden settle chairs, the stools, and the sleeping platforms are built just inches off the floor to keep the occupants safely beneath the smoke line. When you sit in a Blackhouse, you are breathing the clean, fresh air that is drawn in at floor level, while the smoke hangs harmlessly above your head, insulating the roof. The far end of the Blackhouse, separated from the living area by a simple wooden partition, is the domain of the livestock. In the winter of 1894, Ranald's Blackhouse sheltered 8 head of cattle. These animals are not merely livestock. They are biological heaters. A mature cow produces approximately 800 watts of thermal energy through normal metabolic processes. With 8 cows bedded down in the stalls, the animal quarter generates nearly 6,400 watts of heat continuously, day and night. To manage this heat, the roof pitch over the cattle stalls is designed with a very shallow 12-degree angle compared to the 42-degree pitch over the living quarters and the 22-degree pitch over the entrance. This variation in roof height is a calculated response to convection control. As the heat from the cattle rises, the low 12-degree roof compresses the air column, creating a localized zone of high-pressure warm air directly above the stalls. This high-pressure zone acts as a thermal barrier, a warm air curtain that prevents the lower-pressure peat smoke from the living quarters from drifting into the animal section and suffocating the cows. At the same time, this high-pressure air is forced to circulate downward, flowing along the sloped floor towards the human living area, contributing its warmth to the overall energy cycle. The floor of the Blackhouse is designed with a deliberate 1-inch per foot slope toward the cattle stalls, allowing animal waste to drain naturally into a stone-lined gutter that exits through a small hole in the wall. This gravity-driven system maintains hygiene in the human living zone without requiring constant cleaning or water usage. While the lack of a chimney is a thermal advantage, it also serves a critical structural purpose that preserves the very skeleton of the Blackhouse. In the glacial, damp, salt-heavy environment of the Outer Hebrides, timber is the most precious and vulnerable material on the island. Because there are no native forests, every rafter, collar beam, and purlin must be scavenged from the sea. If these timbers rot, the roof collapses, and the home is destroyed. The constant presence of peat smoke inside the Blackhouse is the primary defense against this decay. When peat is burned in the central hearth, it does not release clean, simple heat. Peat is composed of partially decayed vegetation, moss and heather, and its combustion releases a complex mixture of organic compounds, including creosote and phenolic resins. As the warm smoke rises to the peak of the roof, it does not escape immediately. Instead, it filters slowly through the turf and thatch, cooling as it moves outward. As the temperature of the smoke drops, these phenolic resins condense, coating the driftwood rafters and rafters in a thick, black, tar-like layer of soot. This soot layer is a powerful, natural preservative. It is highly antiseptic, preventing the growth of mold, fungi, and rot on the wood, even when the humidity inside the thatch remains constantly high. It also acts as a chemical pesticide, exterminating wood-boring insects such as the deathwatch beetle, which would otherwise devour the soft pine rafters in a matter of seasons. The thatch itself benefits from this process. Over the course of a winter, the barley straw absorbs the phenolic oils from the smoke, becoming saturated with nitrogen and soot. This saturation changes the physical properties of the straw, making it highly resistant to rot from the winter rains. The thatch does not decompose. It becomes a stabilized, chemically treated barrier that repels water and holds its insulating value for years. This process is so effective that the annual stripping of the roof is not a chore of repair, but a harvest of fertility. Every summer, during the flitting period, the oldest layer of soot-saturated thatch is carefully removed. This material is incredibly rich in nitrogen and organic matter, and it is carried to the sandy machair fields to be used as high-grade fertilizer for the oats and barley. Without this constant chemical treatment from the peat fire, the driftwood roof frame would rot within 5 years, and the sandy soil of the island would fail to produce enough food to sustain the population. The Blackhouse is not merely a shelter. It is an active chemical processor that converts local fuel into structural preservation and agricultural fertility. When Gavin Douglas looks at the dark, soot-stained interior of Ranald's home, he sees only dirt and backwardness. He does not see the elegant closed-loop chemistry that has kept the building standing for 80 years without a single replacement rafter. He does not understand that his own clean, white-painted, wood-frame cottage, built with untreated timber and sealed with plaster, has no defense against the damp Hebridean rot that is already beginning to find the joints in his floorboards. By early January 1895, the weather pattern over the North Atlantic began to change. The wind, which had been blowing in predictable moderate gusts from the southwest, went dead calm. The sky took on a hard, leaden-gray color, and the blank sea became flat and dark, like oil. To the older islanders, this silence was not a relief. It was a warning. Ranald MacDonald spent the afternoon of January 7th carrying dry peat from his stack into the Tabata corridor, packing the space near the inner door with enough fuel to last 2 weeks. He checked his livestock, making sure his 8 cows were bedded down in thick straw, and verified that the stone-lined drainage gutter was clear. He checked the Suganane ropes on his roof, tightening the tearing knots and adjusting the suspended stone weights to ensure the thatch was held firm against the coming pressure. In his modern cottage on the hill, Gavin Douglas was preparing for a comfortable winter. He had a large supply of imported coal stored in his cellar, and his quotation propane-heated water system was working well. He sat in his study, writing letters to the estate offices in Edinburgh, describing his progress in modernizing the island and his plans to evict Ranald MacDonald if the old man refused to move into the new cottages. Gavin's house was warm, the coal fire burning brightly in his cast-iron grate, and his wood frame walls, insulated with sawdust and tar paper, held the heat well enough. He looked out his window at the low, rounded shape of Ranald's Blackhouse on the distant ridge and felt a sense of satisfaction. He believed that the cold would soon force the old crofter to admit defeat. The storm struck at midnight on January 8th. It did not begin with snow, but with a sudden, violent drop in barometric pressure that made the timbers of Gavin's house creak. The wind rose from the northwest, climbing from a low moan to a high, screaming howl within minutes. It was a classic polar low, a cyclonic, storm that had formed over the Greenland ice cap and swept down across the ocean. Without obstruction, by morning the wind was registering 95 miles per hour at the fading fade lighthouse, and the temperature had plummeted. It was a damp, biting cold, carrying horizontal sheets of freezing rain that quickly turned to heavy, wet snow. The snow did not fall. It was driven horizontally by the wind, plastering the north-facing walls of every building in Ness. Within 12 hours, the roads were gone, buried under drifts 6 feet high. The 4 sheep on the common grazing land, huddled in the lee of the stone dikes, their fleece packing with ice. The outer Hebrides were cut off from the rest of Scotland, isolated in a white, screaming dark, where the wind chill made the air feel like minus 50 degrees. Inside his Blackhouse, Ranald MacDonald sat on his low 3-legged stool, feeding his central hearth with 3 small blocks of dried peat. The fire burned with a steady, quiet glow, its heat radiating outward into the thick stone walls. The air inside the living quarters was 70 degrees. The cows in the far bay chewed their cud in the dim, warm light, their body heat rising to compress under the low roof, creating the high-pressure curtain that kept the peat smoke in the human zone. The Blackhouse was silent, its dry stone walls absorbing the kinetic shocks of the storm, its weighted thatch roof flexing and holding under the immense pressure of the wind. The battle had begun. On the hill above the harbor, Gavin Douglas's modern cottage was under siege. The wind, hitting the tall, flat vertical walls of the wood frame house at 95 miles per hour, was forced upward with immense velocity. When it reached the overhanging eaves of the slate roof, it created a massive upward lift. With a loud, splintering crack, the wind caught the northern eave, ripping away a 10-foot section of wood and exposing the rafters beneath. Within minutes, the lichenzanably.com gale was prying loose the dark slate tiles, sending them sailing through the air like stone shrapnel. Gavin, huddled in his study with his wife and children, heard the tiles shattering on the frozen ground outside and felt the house begin to vibrate. The brick chimney, designed to draft warm air up and out, was now a liability. The high-velocity wind hitting the top of the chimney created a localized, high-pressure zone that overcame the draft of the fire. The chimney began to backdraft, blowing cold air, soot, and choking coal smoke back into the study. Gavin's wife began to cough, her eyes watering as the room filled with gray dust. He was forced to extinguish the coal fire to prevent his family from suffocating. Without the active fire, the house had no defense against the cold. The single-skin wood frame walls, insulated only with a thin layer of dry sawdust, began to bleed heat almost instantly. The temperature in the study plummeted from 60 degrees to 40 within 2 hours. The large glass windows, designed to let in light, were now cold plates, radiating a freezing chill into the rooms. Frost began to form on the interior plaster, creeping up from the baseboards and around the window frames. Gavin tried to carry wood from his outdoor pile, but the drift against his back door was 5 feet deep, packed hard as concrete. When he managed to shovel his way out, he found his firewood frozen solid, coated in a thick armor of ice from the freezing rain that had preceded the snow. The wood would not catch. It smoldered and hissed, producing only smoke and almost no heat. His children began to cry, their fingers turning blue as they huddled under dozanes, every blanket they owned. The modern cottage, built with imported materials, standard mainland designs, was failing. It was a beautiful, civilized box that was completely unsuited for the raw kinetic power of an Atlantic storm. By the morning of January 11th, the 3rd day of the blizzard, Gavin Douglas knew his family would not survive another night in the cottage. The temperature inside his study had dropped to 34 degrees. The water pipes had frozen and burst in the crawlspace, and his wife's coughing had become deep and wet. Desperate, Gavin wrapped his children in blankets, helped his wife put on her heavy wool coat, and prepared to abandon his modern home. He opened his front door, and the wind nearly knocked him backward. The snow was a white wall, reducing visibility to 10 feet. Holding his youngest son in his arms and supporting his wife with his shoulder, Gavin stumbled down the hill, his boots sinking deep into the drifts. He was heading for the only structure he could see through the white dark, the low, rounded mound of Ranald MacDonald's Blackhouse on the distant ridge. It took them 40 minutes to cover the quarter-mile, fighting for every step against a wind that tried to rip the blankets from his children. When they finally reached the low entrance of the Blackhouse, Gavin's hands were so numb he could not turn the wooden latch. He kicked the door with his boot. The door opened instantly. Ranald stood in the low entryway, his weathered face calm as he reached out and pulled his wife inside, then took the youngest boy from Gavin's arms. As Gavin stepped through the low double-door entrance, transition was so sudden it made his head spin. The roaring scream of the wind vanished, replaced by a deep, dead silence. The cold, which had been biting his face like needles, was gone, replaced by a wave of thick, dry warmth that smelled of burning peat, sheep wool, and cattle. It was 71 degrees inside the living quarters. Ranald's wife helped Gavin's family remove their wet coats, wrapping them in warm, dry wool blankets that had been sitting near the hearth. Gavin stood in the center of the room, blinking through the dim light of the single kerosene lamp. He looked at the thermometer hanging from the rafters. 68 degrees. He touched the inner stone wall. It was warm to the hand, radiating a gentle heat that held no dampness. The earth floor was dry and warm. In the far bay, the 8 cows stood quietly in their stalls, their massive bodies generating a steady warmth that rose to compress under the low roof, creating the high-pressure curtain that kept the peat smoke in the human zone. There was no frost on the walls. There was no dripping condensation on the ceiling. The Blackhouse, built with scavenged driftwood and dry stone, was warm and dry in the middle of a -50-degree wind-chill blizzard, and it was doing it on 3 blocks of peat. As the storm raged outside, rattling the thick stone walls but failing to move a single rafter, Gavin Douglas sat on a low wooden stool near the peat hearth. He held a mug of hot broth in his hands, his fingers slowly regaining their circulation, and watched his children playing on the warm earth floor with Ranald's grandchildren. The contrast between his frozen, ruined cottage on the hill and this warm, quiet, stone sanctuary was complete. The backward, uncivilized hovel had saved his life, while his triumph of modern architecture had nearly killed his family. He looked at Ranald, who was sitting across the hearth, quietly carving a piece of driftwood with a pocket knife. Gavin reached into his heavy wool coat, pulled out the damp, crumpled eviction notice he had written weeks before, and stared at it. He thought of his pride, his belief that modernization meant progress, and his contempt for the old ways. He knew that if he had forced Ranald to move into the wood-frame cottage, the old man's family might be freezing on the hill, right? Now, without saying a word, Gavin leaned forward and dropped the paper into the center of the peat fire. The dry paper caught instantly, flared with a bright yellow flame for 3 seconds, and then vanished into white ash, absorbed by the ancient peat fire. It was a silent admission of error, a quiet surrender of pride in the face of natural law. The blizzard broke on January 14th. When the sun finally rose over Ness, the islanders emerged to find the landscape transformed. 2 wood-frame houses had suffered partial roof collapses, and several sheep had been lost to the drifts. But every single black house in the parish stood undamaged. The low, rounded shapes had deflected the wind, the weighted thatch had held, and the dry stone walls had kept the interior warmth secure. The lesson of the winter of 1895 was one that the community would never forget. In the years that followed, Gavin Douglas did not press for the eviction of the crofters or the destruction of their traditional homes. Instead, he worked with Ranald and the local builders to study the engineering of the Blackhouse, incorporating the double skin wall and the Taigh design into new construction projects across the island. He understood that real progress does not mean abandoning the past. It means understanding why the old ways worked and applying that wisdom to new challenges. The Blackhouse was not a relic of poverty, but a masterpiece of passive design, built by people who understood their environment better than any mainland engineer. Today, only a few of the original Outer Hebrides blackhouses remain standing as preserved landmarks, but their legacy lives on. They are a testament to the power of indigenous design, proving that we can find elegant, low-cost solutions to our greatest energy challenges if we are humble enough to learn from those who came before us. Ranald MacDonald's home proved that survival is not about fighting the person/environment, but about working within its laws. And that is a lesson that keeps us warm long after the fire goes out. Thank you for watching. And if you want to support our channel, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of survival and design.